All right, welcome everyone to our final class of our Judaism at Home 5-part series. Very, very exciting, coming up on the holiday of Shavuos. Perfect time to be discussing these very practical laws of the Torah on the holiday when God gave us the Torah. And of course, a holiday in Judaism is not just something that happened long ago. Actually, before we get to the actual class, I heard a very beautiful insight about what a Jewish holiday is really all about. There was a parable, there's a mushal, about a king who was wandering with his whole retinue going through a forest on a hunting trip. That was a pastime of the kings. And all of a sudden the prince gets thirsty. The young prince gets thirsty, he wants some water. So what do? You got the prince, right? The prince is hungry, the prince gets water. So...
Or thirsty.
The prince is thirsty, yeah. So the king sends his men and they go back, they trek all the way back to the city. It takes 20 minutes, let's say, running on the fastest horses. And they bring drills and they bring these big, plumb lines, and they dig a well right there in the middle of the forest. And after about an hour of hard labor by everybody and all the king's men, as they say, the well is dug, fresh water bubbles up, and this prince is able to drink. And afterwards, the prince asked his father, why'd you do it in such a way? It took me longer. Why don't you just ask them to go back to the city and bring me some water instead of going and, going through this whole process of building a well and doing the whole, the ganze Shvera Aveda, the 39 malachas, as we're gonna see in this class. So the father told him, my son, if I would have just got you some water, then your thirst would be satiated now, but in the future, if you ever got thirsty again while you're crossing this way, you wouldn't have anything to drink. But now that I've dug you a well, I've established a place where you and your descendants can get water and receive their nourishment forever. So, similarly, in Judaism, when an event happens, that event is not the reason we celebrate. Interestingly enough, Kabbalah explains, the event is just an indicator that on this day there's a special spiritual power that's present in the world, and that's why this day was chosen. On the day of Pesach, for example, God took us out of Egypt. We don't celebrate freedom because God took us out of Egypt. God took us out of Egypt on that day because every year on that day, there's a special element of freedom. There's a avir, there's a certain ruchnius, a certain spiritual power of freedom, and that's why that day was a day which was set aside since the beginning of history for God to perform that miracle for the Jews, just like we have in space. We know that, spatially, the place of the Holy Temple in Israel in general is a holy spot. Similarly, in time, we have similar islands in time, which are holy times which are given to a certain spiritual experience, and that's really what Shavuos is all about. Shavuos, we're not just getting the Torah anew, but we are experiencing that same divine love that we experienced. So, the screen sharing is currently undergoing some health issues. So I guess we'll begin the class without it. I will, of course, be posting over here on the chat. I'm going to post right here, and we're going to post it to Facebook afterwards. Some of the interesting links that we're going to be dealing with. It's quite a colorful class with some interesting links over there. So I guess we'll begin the old-fashioned way, without the student guide. And if it decides to behave, then we'll go over to that. So we started last class with our discussion of Shabbos. We spoke about Friday night and some of the customs associated with that. And as we move along the Shabbos experience from Friday night to Shabbos day, there's two ways you could look at it. You could look at it as, I observed and celebrated Shabbos last night. I had a very good spiritual experience. It was very beautiful, the whole family. And now I'm kind of on autopilot. I'm just drifting, like in space. If you kick off, you just keep going and going and going. Or another attitude you could have is to ask yourself, how can I advance today? How can I deepen my Shabbos experience from the day before? And Shabbos is really meant to be looked at in the second attitude. And this is actually apparent from the Shabbos prayers themselves. Again, if the screen share was working, I'd be able to show you. I guess you'll have to take my word for it. So in the Shabbos prayers, it's very interesting. We say the Shmona Esrei, the Amidah, actually 4 times, but 3 main times on Shabbos. By Friday night, we say it by Ma'ariv, by the evening prayer. We say it the next day by Shacharit, and then by Musaf and by Mincha. And it's interesting to know that on Friday night, the main paragraph of the Shemona Esrei of the Amidah, which deals with Shabbat, starts with the words Ata Kidashta, which means you have sanctified. On the next day, Shabbat morning, the Shacharit prayer begins with the words Yismach Moshe, and Moshe rejoiced. And that later that afternoon in Mincha, Shabbos afternoon Mincha, the main section of the Amidah, which is put there especially for Shabbos, begins with the words Ata Echad, you are one. And they're all very beautiful prayers, but it's interesting how there's a certain pattern to how they begin, and we're going to see that in a minute. Another additional interesting difference is that at the end of that prayer, at the end of that blessing, we're thanking God for Shabbos, and we say, thank you for giving us this Shabbos, and we will rest in it. Except by the three different Amidas, or three different prayers, we use slightly different words to describe Shabbos. On Friday night, we say V'yanuchu va. Va in Hebrew is the feminine term. So literally it means, and we will rest, the Jewish people will rest in her. We refer to Shabbat in the feminine. As we saw in the last class, Shabbat is referred to as a queen, a feminine aspect in many different places in the davening. On Shabbat morning, however, we say V'yanuchu vo. We refer to Shabbos as in the masculine term, and we will rest in him, which also means it. So if you're not paying attention, these little differences in the liturgy could slip right by you, but if you look at them as they play out, and finally on Shabbat afternoon, we say V'yanuchu vam. We refer to Shabbat in the plural. We will rest in them, in the Shabbats that God has given us. We will rest. And again, this is the blessing, thanking God for Shabbos. So what's the reason for these slight changes? So to explain that, I'll have to tell you a little bit about how Jewish weddings work, or how they worked in the olden days. Really, there's three main parts to a Jewish wedding. The first step is called Kiddushin. That is the famous visual we see, the bride giving the groom giving the bride a ring and telling her, Hareyat mikudeshet li, you are sanctified to me. And that is what we would call the engagement. But it's not an engagement like we have now. First of all, it's a much more binding sort of attachment. It can only be dissolved either through death of one of them or through divorce. So it's basically as binding as marriage. However, they're not allowed to live together as a couple. They're not allowed to build a home yet. The second step that follows is called the nisuin, which is the actual marriage of standing under the chuppah that a lot of us are familiar with, saying 7 special blessings, and then the bride and groom secluding themselves in a room. It's called yichud for a few minutes. Now nowadays, these two steps are done very, very close to each other. They're done within minutes. Under the chuppah, the groom gives the bride the ring, and then they say the 7 blessings, and afterwards they go into the yichud room, and then they go and dance by the main hall. But in the times of the Talmud, it wasn't like that. The Kiddushin was usually held many months before the actual wedding, and it was held at the bride's parents' home. That was the etiquette. They had a very interesting set of rules of etiquette in those days. And then once the Kiddushin was executed, the bride and the groom would separate and prepare for the wedding separately. Then, several months later, or several weeks later, the Nisuin would be held at the groom's house, the groom's parents' home. And then after this ceremony, the bride and the groom would move to the home that they would share together, a separate home, separate from the bride's parents or the groom's parents, and they would build their family together, Binyan Adiyah, the Jewish home. So the Shabbos experience, getting back to our original discussion, is compared to a marriage, because when you have a marriage, you have two distinct people who are coming together despite their differences and despite that they're two very distinct different people. Similarly, Shabbos is the day when we, who are human beings, who have a certain rhythm to our lives, a certain struggle, and God, who lives above all that, come together. We become a little more godly, and therefore our connection to God becomes much more profound. God's serenity, that element of God, which is sort of goes beyond our physical struggles, becomes present in this world. So Shabbat is compared to a marriage. So, following these 3 stages in a marriage, we start off, as I mentioned, on Friday night with the phrase Ata Kidashta, you have made holy. But as we mentioned before, Kiddushin is also the word which is used for the engagement, the first step. And being that this engagement was typically done at the bride's home, we refer to Shabbat in the feminine form, the Yenuchuva, at Friday night. On Shabbat day, as we advance through Shabbat, we are advancing in our level of intimacy and closeness with the Eibishter, with God. So we say Yismach Moshe, Simcha, happiness, like the actual wedding. The engagement is more of a toned down happiness, more of a preparation. The wedding is where the main thing happens. For anyone who's ever been to a Jewish wedding, it gets quite intense. And that's why we refer to Shabbat as the masculine The masculine form, v'yenuchuvo, because as we mentioned, that was typically done in the groom's house. Shabbat afternoon is compared to when the bride and the groom move to their own house, and their marriage becomes something which is much more solid. It's not just something that's based on emotion, it's something which is based on a real connection, a real joining of souls. And that's why we begin our tefillah in the Amidah. We begin the part which is talking about Shabbat with Ata Echad, you are one, a unity. We're no longer two parts coming together, but we are one whole. And we refer to Shabbat as them, the Enuchuvam. So again, we see from this that Shabbat is not something which is stationary. You don't stay on Friday night and just do it again on Shabbat day and do it again Shabbat afternoon. As we're going to see, you're supposed to really internalize Shabbat and kind of grow as the day goes on. So that's what we're going to try and explore and try and gain some insight from the various customs and the various tefillos that we do on Shabbat day. So let's get started. So let's speak about the meal. So the meal on Shabbat day has a lot of similarities to the meal Shabbat night. We recite Kiddush with a slightly different liturgy for Kiddush. You can find it in your Siddurim. Again, let me see if the screen sharing works now. Maybe it worked. I was just waiting for intros to finish. Nope, still not working. All right. We wash our hands. We wash our bread, as we mentioned before on Friday night, and we are supposed to have a lot of lavish, good foods. And one of the most anticipated and famous recognizable foods, especially among Ashkenazi Jews, is called cholent. How do you describe cholent? Cholent is everything but the kitchen sink. Cholent is it's an age-old recipe. It usually contains potatoes, beans, onions, meat. Some people put in eggs. Everyone's got their own cholent recipe. It's as unique as the Jewish people, and nobody could really agree which one's the best. Just kidding, my mother's is. But the point is, why do we have a cholent on Friday night? We have a cholent on Friday night. For those who remember from our last class, we mentioned that one of the reasons we light Shabbat candles is because there were some Jews who mistakenly misinterpreted the Torah. When the Torah tells us, Lo sevaru eish mososechem, you should not have a fire burning in your house on Shabbat, some of them interpreted it literally, that you should not have a fire at all burning in your house on Shabbat, which led them to have very cold, dark Shabbat nights and Shabbat days, which was very depressing. It wasn't really in the spirit of Shabbos. So, to kind of show and to kind of demonstrate how they weren't, how we do not hold of this, and the Torah is referring to the fact that we cannot light a fire, but we can have a fire burning, and we are encouraged to add to the joy of Shabbos. They would demonstrate this by having a cholent, a stew, which would be sitting on a fire from before Shabbat, and it would continue cooking until Shabbat began, and until Shabbat day, which just increases the flavor and the richness of it. So typically we have cholent on a crock pot nowadays, and we're going to speak about some of the ways of permissibly cooking food on Shabbos once we get more into the malachas. Now, what specific acts are off limits on Shabbos? We know that Shabbos is known as a day of rest. What this means is we cannot do a malacha. So, this is quite an interesting subject, and you have to preface a little bit with how the Torah works. A lot of people will look at a chumash, the blue stone edition chumashim that we have, and they'll look through it and they'll say a lot of the stuff that we do as Jews is not written there. You will not find gefilte fish in the Torah, to the best of my knowledge. You will not find a yarmulke, I believe, unless it's hinted to, but there is no specific instruction to a yarmulke. Tefillin are written in the very, very basic, the barest little hints, and the sages explained what exactly tefillin was. So something that has to be understood about the Torah is that the Torah is written like a set of notes. Imagine you were in university and you have a very difficult, very deep class or lecture you're attending, and it's going very fast, so you jot down some very sparse, very bare notes. Those notes contain the entire lecture, but if they're read by anybody else, they would be unintelligible. They would be complete nonsense, or they would mean something other than what you meant. You jot down a few words here, shorthand. Anybody's ever seen one of those stenographers thing? They write like these little hints, and then afterwards, the computer or whatever, the algorithm expands them back into words. So the Torah is written very, very bare, very sparse, and it was given to Moshe in writing. It's called Torah Shebechsav. Additionally, along with the Torah Shebechsav, imagine following our university mashal. Imagine you loan your notes to somebody else. You can't just loan your notes to them. You have to sit with them and explain all your notes. So while Moshe was up there for 40 days and 40 nights, God explained to him the meaning behind everything. He gave him 13 principles by which the Torah, every word in the Torah, can be dissected and expanded. Now, obviously, Torah is much more profound than the notes example I gave, because it was written by God, who is infinite, so his wisdom is also infinite. So the Torah has infinite meaning to it, but on a very halachic, a very legalistic perspective, all the deeper meanings and all the ways called the methods of exegesis, how the Torah is expounded, was given to Moshe on Har Sinai along with a very rich oral custom. And this oral custom explains to us, first of all, the fact that Shabbat, you're allowed to have a fire burning that we just mentioned, as long as you don't light it. The malacha, all the Torah says is, you should not do a malacha. Do not do any work. Although we're going to explain exactly what that means. So the oral tradition, which the rabbis transmitted from person to person by word until Rabbeinu HaKadosh wrote it down in the Mishnah. The Mishnah was basically like taking the explanations for those notes and then writing those down, because they were beginning to be forgotten by the Jewish people due to all the hard, all the troubles they were going through. But the Mishnah itself was also very sparse. Later came the Talmud, which explained all the little hints hinted to in the Mishnah. As we said, the Torah is infinite, so the Mishnah, which is written down, was also written down very sparse. And then the Talmud explains that more. Then the later poskim explained it more. The later halachic, the commentators explained it all the way till nowadays, when it's still being explained for new things like electricity and plumbing. We have to apply it and explain and expound, and that is the job of qualified rabbis. So, in the Mishnah, it takes the word malacha, which is written in the Torah, and it expounds it into 39 basic kinds of malacha, basic kinds of work. I'm going to run through them really fast. The first 11 deal with baking, general things related to baking. The next, from 11 to 31, deal with making cloth and leather, and from 31 to 38 deals with construction. And the last one is an exception we're going to speak about. You're not allowed to sow, to plow, to reap, to bind sheaves together, which we're going to discuss, to thresh, separate the stalks from the seeds, to winnow, to select something which is wanted for something which is not wanted, or vice versa, grinding, sifting, kneading, or baking. Additionally, you're not allowed to shear an animal, to shear the wool off an animal, to bleach, to comb, to dye, to spin, to stretch threads on a loom. In the olden days, they would make thread by hand, so they would stretch it on a loom. Making the loop, setting up the loom, weaving, separating the threads of a weave that become tangled, tying a knot, untying a knot, sewing, tearing, trapping, slaughtering, skinning, tanning, smoothing, scoring, and cutting. Again, if I had the student handout, this would be much simpler because I wouldn't have to read it, but either way. Writing, erasing, building or breaking down, something called striking the final hammer's blow, to put the finishing touch on something which is unfinished, extinguishing a fire and kindling a fire, which we've been discussing quite a lot, and the last one, carrying from a public domain into a private domain, which is quite a pertinent one. So, the Mishnah refers to these 39 things that I mentioned as the avos malachos, the parent malachas. We're going to see why in a second. In general, each one of these includes a whole gamut of smaller, more nuanced sorts of malacha, sorts of work. For example, the malacha of planting, you're not allowed to plant, as we mentioned, which means taking a seed and putting something into the ground for the purpose of, for facilitating life, facilitating growth. For that reason, the oral Torah tells us that included within planting is watering a plant, because although it's not the same action, it's going towards the same point. So even though in action might not be the same, in spirit, it's very much the same. Similarly, we said you're not allowed to thresh, to separate a seed from the chaff. So in the same way, you're not allowed to milk a cow, because although milking a cow is very different than threshing, it's the same idea. You're taking something edible, taking something useful from something which you cannot immediately use. Gluing papers together is a tolda. Tolda means an offspring. That's the word that's used. There's the 39 avos, the parents, and the offspring. So gluing is not allowed because of its similarity in theme to sewing. And similarly, plucking out hair is not allowed because it's similar to shearing. Or making mud is not allowed because it's similar to kneading. So all these things, there's many, many, many very nuanced kind of gradations that sort of exponentially go out of each malacha. So what is special about these 39 categories? They seem a bit random. So let's speak more about the teichen, as we say. What's more about the meaning of these things? So we have to distinguish between the words malacha and avoda. A famous story. My friend of mine said he was doing a minyan on one of the higher floors on a hotel, and we know that you can't use an elevator, as we're going to speak about. So it was one of the high floors, say the 30th floor. So he was trekking up the stairs, and he was going and he was running because he was late. And when he got there, one of the congregants said, "Rabbi, you're red, you're sweating. Why can't you just take the elevator?" He says, "Oh, it's my day of rest. I'm sorry, I cannot take the elevator. It's my day of rest." So it's interesting that you could truck up 30 flights of stairs, but you can't use an elevator. So it's important to quantify what kind of work can we do and what kind of work can we not do. And the explanation is one that really makes sense. So we have to distinguish between malacha and avoda. Not sure if this is how it works in modern Hebrew, but definitely in biblical Hebrew, malacha means a craft. It means work, but it's more of a intelligent, productive kind of work. Avoda is what we mean when we say schlepping. Avoda is sweating, working at it, doing something strenuous and exhausting. Now, the Torah says you cannot do a malacha. A malacha is something which, to use one definition, it's when man uses his mind to make a change in nature for the better. For example, when you sew, you are taking a substance, you are spinning it into thread, you are changing it into something useful. That is a malacha. And avoda would be running up 30 flights of stairs. Now, if you think about it, it makes perfect sense that we could do an avoda, but we can't do a malacha, because the reason that we rest on Shabbat, as we spoke about in the previous lesson, is because God rested from creating the world on the seventh day. That is the reason we rest. Now, I don't think God toils at anything, because he's God, and that's kind of not his thing. Everything's pretty easy for him. It's pretty simple. What God did do was he rested from doing an intelligence, from making the systems of the world, from constructing the world in an intelligent way. That's what God desisted from. So, similarly, on Shabbat, what we have to stop, we have to seize, is the malacha, the productive kind of work, which is akin to the work God did in creating the world. So that's why you could run up 30 flights of stairs, but you can't turn on a light bulb, because the light bulb demonstrates how you are being a creator. You are taking the wisdom God gave you and you're using it for something productive, something that wasn't there before. Now, why can't we do it on Shabbos? First of all, because God rested. But in a more spiritual sense, God put us on this world to make the world a better place, as we know. God put us here to be little microcosms of himself, little creators, as it were. To take the world, which is messy and disorganized, and put it and make it better, put it in a way that is peaceful and just and right. The thing is, there's an occupational hazard involved in this. If we're so busy being creators, it's sometimes easy to forget that we are in fact creations. So we are entirely dependent on God every second, every day. And to also remember that our work is still dependent on God. God gives us success. God gives us hatzlacha. Shabbos is a day when we step back from being a creator. We take a pause. We lay aside the tools God has given us to recognize and to embrace his presence in our lives. The fact that we are just his creations. So that is why, as we mentioned in the previous class, we stop our businesses, we stop our work, which is very hard, but it demonstrates the fact that we believe and we have this conviction that we are creations. That God is running everything. So as much as we are creators, and this is something God gave us, he wants it to be that way, we should still remember, have a little station identification so we don't miss our stop. Remember what's what. So that's why we stop these malachas specifically, because these are the ones that, thematically are very related to what Shabbos is trying to achieve. So, getting more in detail, there are many, if you think about it, there's an entire tractate in the Talmud, there are thousands of books. As you say, as a Yiddish expression, how much ink was spilled over this subject. There are thousands of books discussing Shabbos through the ages, the minutiae of it. We're going to touch upon a few of the very, very more pertinent things that are practical, but this is a drop in the sea. This is a hydrogen atom in the sea. This is nothing, but it's good to know. It's not nothing. It's very, very small. All right, let's start with cooking and baking, which is something that's present in every home. We are not allowed, because of the prohibition to light a fire, you're not allowed to put food in a fire, in an oven, or a microwave on Shabbos. You're not allowed to extinguish a flame or lower a flame or turn off an oven, etc. All those kind of things which are related to cooking, to baking, to turning on a fire, etc. are not allowed. So how do you have hot food on Friday night? So we touched upon it, but here's a few of the options. First of all, you can put your food in the oven right before Shabbos and switch off the oven, and the oven retains the heat. If you switch it off right before Shabbos, chances are that when your Friday night meal comes around, you'll have hot food. One thing to remember about that is you have to turn off the oven light, because when you open the light, a light bulb is also related to fire. It's also related to bona. It's completing a circuit, which is a whole different discussion in and of itself. Another option to have hot food is to put the oven on a timed bake, to start a time bake before Shabbos, and then you can have it going for as long as you want. It's just preferable to have the bake completed before you remove the food. We're going to speak about some of those things after we mention some of the options. An additional option might be a hot plate, which a lot of families use. I actually attached a link to a hot plate, which is good to use for Shabbos, in case everyone doesn't know how to Google a hot plate, I guess. And another option, which has been used for Jewish families for years, is to have a tin or metal sheet which you lay on the stove. You light the fire on the stove. The fire is going to have to stay on the whole Shabbat. So a lot of families don't do this because it'll make the house pretty hot. But you put a metal sheet over the fire to prevent you from accidentally adjusting the fire. And this metal sheet has one of the best names in Yiddish. It's called a blech. Yiddish is a beautiful, beautiful language. It's called a blech. A blech means a tin. They were made out of tin. So this blech allows you to have food cooking on this blech. It was basically like a crock pot before crock pots were invented, and a lot of people still use them. And again, of course, it's crock pots, which we use for our cholent. Now, a few important notes. When serving the food, it has to be removed from the crock pot, from the blech, what have you. It should be removed, and it cannot be put back on, because then you are putting something on the fire. So that is strictly for the purposes of keeping it there until you're ready to use it. Another interesting halacha is that when you're using one of the measures we described, at the time Shabbat goes in, the food should either be ready to eat and it's just being kept warm, or it should be completely not ready to eat and it's going to be cooked over Shabbos. The reason for this is if the food is somewhere in the middle, a person might forget and adjust the settings, adjust the flame, etc., to make sure the food cooks the way he wants it to. So the sage is instituted as a safeguard to make sure that the food is either completely ready, so there's no worry about that, or it's not ready at all, so you know you're just going to leave it, you put it in before Shabbos, and you leave it to its own devices. In the same light, to make sure you don't accidentally make any adjustments, you cover the dials, you cover any knobs and switches in the range, the crock pot, etc., to make sure you don't accidentally touch it. And since also you can't switch on lights, that's another helpful thing to do. They sell these little light switches you can put over your light. I know I personally have a instinct that my father drilled into me when I was a kid, that whenever you leave a room, you shut the lights, because you don't want to waste energy. So having one of those is very helpful. And when food is on a blech, you are allowed to move the food closer or further to the fire, but as we mentioned, you cannot take it off and then put it back on. You also can't take any cold food and put it close enough to the blech that it will cook, but you can put frozen solid food, close enough that it will begin to thaw. It does not work with liquids, and again, this does not work with cooking, just defrosting. Now, when it comes to hot water on Shabbos, the simplest way is to use an urn, which is what we use in shul on Shabbos. That big cylindrical monstrosity that holds an unnecessary amount of really hot water. It keeps it hot over Shabbos. It has to be filled and plugged in and hot before Shabbos starts. Now, on the same subject, when it comes to making a coffee or tea on Shabbos, the actual water, if it's come straight out of a heated pot that's on the fire, let's say, that water also has the ability to cook. So by making a coffee with that water, you could transgress the prohibition of cooking on Shabbos. So what you need to do is you have to pour the water from, let's say, the urn. You put the water from the urn into one cup, one dry cup, and then you pour it. This is called a kli sheni or kli shlishi. You pour it from this cup, which is hot, to another dry cup, and there's a halachic principle that the doifnei akli haylech u'meskara, the new cup, lessens the heat of the water, and then you are allowed to put in your cocoa powder, your tea bag, etc. So that's something interesting to remember, and we usually have a sign in shul describing that process. Now, electricity. Let's speak about electricity. That's a big subject on Shabbos. One of the harder things for people who are beginning to take upon themselves some of the Shabbos practices. So, what is wrong with electricity exactly? So there's a few different things. First of all, in the case of some electronics which involve a flame or a heat source, there's obviously the thing about turning on a fire. Also, mailid. Mailid means to create something new. First of all, in terms of the theme that we've discussed about, every malacha being man imposing himself on nature and making a change, so electricity definitely falls under that category. Also, completing a circuit, according to many halachic authorities, constitutes mailid, which means to make something new that wasn't there before, or baina, building, and seiser, destroying once you close the circuit. So for that reason, we do not use any phones, computers, tablets, television. We become Amish folks for 24 hours, beers and all. Also, the alarm clock, it's a good idea to have an alarm which automatically shuts off, or to shut off your alarm, not making that mistake twice. We also don't turn off and on any lights. Before Shabbos, it's a good idea to set the lights in the places you're going to be using, and turn off the lights in the places you're not going to be using, such as your bedroom, not making that mistake either, again. And also any appliances that have lights that turn automatically when they're opened, set to, if they have them a Shabbos mode. I've actually attached a link over here to Star K to check. They have a whole list over there. Many mainstream brands have started including a Shabbat setting into their appliances so that a light does not turn on Shabbos. That's quite an interesting trend that's starting catching on. I guess they realize that a lot of Jews buy them now. So you could use that link to find out whether any of your appliances have a Shabbat setting. So that's something that should be taken care of before Shabbat. Also, the thermostat, we do not change on Shabbos. A lot of things involving, again, heating a fire. Now, you are allowed to use a timer. I've actually attached a link to the kind of timer that we use. It's a timer that you put over an outlet, and any electric appliance you can attach to this timer and have it turn on and off on its own. We pretty much essentially only use this for lights. Again, lights are very much in the spirit of Shabbos. We know the Shabbos candles are supposed to add light to the house, which is something that's very encouraged. But other things like college football, let's say, are not really in the spirit of Shabbos, so we do not use those timers to start TVs or radios or that kind of thing. It's called Uvin Nechel, it's not in the spirit of Shabbos. We also do not use elevators unless it's a specially designed Shabbos elevator. I came across a very interesting sort of video sort of dissecting the Shabbos elevator, all the things related to that. So that's something interesting to look out for. I've included that link, I think, right there. Yeah, I've included the link in the chat section, and we're going to post that on Facebook afterwards. Additionally, riding a car is not allowed on Shabbat because the internal combustion engine is very dependent on the combustion, which is done internally, as implied by the name, which basically means that the engine, as I understand, basically explodes gases and things. That's what you're sitting on when you drive. It's a bunch of explosions. So every time you brake, you are turning off a fire, and every time you drive, you are, starting many fires. So instead, we walk. And on Shabbat, now that we're talking about walking, we know the last malacha that we discussed is carrying. So when you're walking, you cannot carry even the smallest thing. You can't carry keys in your pocket. Can't carry a water bottle, a child. Not allowed to carry anything. Although we're going to speak about some different things that the rabbi has instituted to make that easier for us. For that reason, the Code of Jewish Law highly recommends that before you go out on Shabbat, you just pat down, like they do at the airport. You check your pockets to make sure you're not carrying anything. And for that reason, you can't push a stroller or ride a bicycle. Also, you're carrying them as you're moving. Now, there are two ways to get someplace if you need it carried. One of them is an eruv. This is something which some of you may have heard of. An eruv is a very thin string that encircles a city or a neighborhood. On Sukkot, I make an eruv from our shul to the sukkah so we can carry when Sukkot falls on Shabbos. The eruv essentially, I'm not going to go into the exact halachic details of it, but an eruv essentially makes it as if there's a wall. Halachically speaking, there's a wall surrounding the city, and within an enclosed area, obviously you can carry in a building because it's enclosed by walls. So the eruv makes it, it's called a Tzuras HaPesach. The eruv makes it that the entire community is considered one enclosed area, and then you can carry in the eruv. Many people do not use an eruv even if it's a kosher one, because if there's even one discontinuation within the eruv, then it's no good. So people use it mostly as a fallback if they accidentally have something in their pockets, but that is something which is widely used by a lot of very holy Jews, especially if people are just starting. An eruv is something they can definitely use if you live in a community that has one. Another additional thing for keys, for example, people who are walking to shul and leaving their house empty, they don't want to leave it unlocked because someone might get in and steal all their cholent, is a bendel. A bendel is a little belt which has a little section for a key. The thing is, if you have a thing you're carrying, but that thing is an integral part of your clothing, then you're allowed to carry it because it's no longer carrying, it is clothing. So a bendel is a little belt which has a section over here. See if you can see it. And what it does is, it essentially makes it that the key is now completing the belt. And so it's no longer a key, it is now a part of your clothing. So if you have a key you have to carry, so we do when we're carrying from shul, you put a key in the bendel and then you're allowed to do that. Additionally, an interesting thing when it comes to walking around is that it's highly discouraged to run on Shabbos. It's not in the proper spirit of Shabbos. If you're running everywhere, Shabbos is supposed to be a relaxing, peaceful thing, unless you're running for a mitzvah, or you're running because in some way that adds in the pleasure of Shabbos for you. In that case, it's okay. But in general, to run somewhere and to introduce that sense of urgency is not really so frowned upon. All right, now let's speak about muktzah. So besides from the 39 malachas that we spoke about, the sages instituted for various reasons other ordinances to protect us from accidentally transgressing the malachas of Shabbos. And that means that there are many objects that are not allowed to be touched on Shabbos. That's called muktzah. Muktzah literally means set aside or designated, and it refers to the fact that certain objects are designated for a use which is forbidden on Shabbos. There are many, many categories of muktzah, and it's really beyond the scope of this class. But very simply, a main category of muktzah is anything which is used for something which is not permitted on Shabbos. So on Shabbos, one is not allowed to write. So a pen whose primary purpose is writing is not allowed to be touched on Shabbos, lest you come to transgress the malacha. Also, the sages realize that if people are allowed to touch various things which are not necessary for Shabbos, then even though their Shabbos is going to be a day of rest in the letter of the law, the spirit of it, people might take their household chores while they're too busy to do and cram it all into Shabbos. So Shabbos will become like a day of getting the house cleaned up, and that's not really in the spirit of Shabbos. So there are certain things which they made muktzah for that reason. If you have something muktzah, it is generally not allowed to be touched. However, litzarech mekaymer, which means if you need the place, if you need the thing which that muktzah thing is resting on, you are allowed to move it. So, for example, if there's a table that you need to use, but there's a pen on it, you can remove the pen for the purpose of using the table. Although it's preferable to do it with a small change, to do it with a shinoi. For example, to brush the pencil off with your breath or with your elbow. That is something which is encouraged because we want to minimize the amount of muktzah contact we're having. And additionally, one of the preparations to be done on Erev Shabbos, as we mentioned on our last class, that there are many things to be done on Friday as a preparation for Shabbos, is to do a sweep to make sure there are no muktzah things around your house. So, we mentioned about the bendel and the eruv, and in general in Judaism, there's a lot of things that seem to be like loopholes, like selling your chametz on Pesach. Jews aren't allowed to own chametz on Pesach, so we sell it. We sell it to a non-Jew. Also, a Jew is not allowed to take interest from another Jew, but there's something called a heter iska, which means there's a very complicated halachic, little strategy so that you can essentially take a modified form of ribis, a modified form of interest. So, what's the deal? It's time. I think we should address what is the deal with all these hacks, with all these loopholes. So, to understand these loopholes in their proper context, we have to give an example, and we have a perfect example. Let's take the example of Zoom. We know that the governments and the rabbinic authorities instituted many different safeguards to prevent this terrible virus from traveling to those who we love. And one of them, let's say there's a Jew named Yankel. Yankel realizes that he's not allowed to go and visit his Bubby and Zaidi, who he loves so dearly, because of Corona. So Yankel's a good grandson, so he stays away. But then Yankel sees his brother, Moshe, is Zoom calling his grandparents. So Yankel says, "Are you crazy? What's wrong with you? Don't you care?" So Moshe says, "What's the problem?" Yankel says, "The government said that you're not allowed to see or talk or have any conversations or visits with your grandparents. Why are you trying to find loopholes and undermine the government?" So why is that preposterous? Because we have the proper context of why these safeguards were enforced. They were enforced to prevent physical contact. There's nothing wrong with emotional contact or speaking. So similarly, all of these laws about Shabbos and in general have to be taken in their proper context. The problem is that they are divine commandments, and we don't have the broad vision to really see them in the proper context. And that's why we have to rely on, again, the oral tradition and the rabbis, the rabbanim of the Talmud and the Mishnah. When there's an accepted loophole, an accepted strategy, which was put forth by very holy men. For example, the eruv we spoke about, which allows you to carry, was put forth by Solomon himself when he realized that people were suffering because they couldn't carry. So when you have a halachic authority who is trusted and really puts forth this loophole, then it isn't a loophole at all. What it's saying is that somebody who really is in tune with God enough to understand, and he bases it on a solid foundation from the oral Torah, is saying with confidence that I know what the what the letter of the law and what the spirit of the law, more importantly, is saying, and this is okay, this does not contravene it. So God does not, when God told us not to carry, he didn't mean that he doesn't want keys to get from shul to our house. What he meant was, do not carry them in this way, which is not permitted, to carry them from a private domain to a public domain and back into a private domain. If we have a strategy which is put forth by the Chachamim, by the holy men, by the leaders of Israel of days gone by, then we can rely that this does not contravene the spirit of the law. And again, this is why we cannot make our own loopholes, as correct as they may seem to us. So that's an important thing to keep in mind. All right, so that is what we're going to talk about with regards to Shabbat day. Now let's speak about Havdalah, which is a very beautiful, very profound prayer. So let me see if the screen sharing works one last time, because Havdalah is really quite beautiful. All right, still doesn't work. We'll have to figure that out. Either way, Havdalah is a prayer we say at the end of Shabbos, after we've davened the evening prayer. And the essential theme of Kabbalah is a comfort. We know that Shabbos is really, for a lot of people who really try and understand, like we've been speaking about in the previous classes, the spirit of Shabbos. Shabbos is an oasis in a sort of a sea or a desert of troubles, of brain noise. Shabbos is a day you can really, relax, and that's as far as the person. But as far as the soul, which we're not all in tune with, the soul experiences a very powerful pleasure on Shabbos. We mentioned in the previous class that there's an neshama yaseira, there's an additional soul, an additional level of depth in the soul's connection to God, which is very precious. When Shabbat leaves, it's something which is very devastating. There's a very interesting story. The Baal Shem Tov met a villager who was known for having a very elaborate Suda Shlishis, known as Shalosh Shudas. Suda Shlishis is the third meal which you eat right as Shabbos is ending, a little bit before. Sometimes it goes through the end of Shabbat, and you pray afterwards, and you conclude Shabbat officially. He would have this meal with many, many Jews. So the Baal Shem Tov asked him, why do you feel the need to have such an elaborate meal for the third meal? Why do you have so many people around you? So the Jew says, I often hear people saying that when they die, in those days it was dangerous. Living is, in general, very dangerous. Almost 100% of people who've lived have died from it. So he's heard people saying that when they die, they want to be around Jews. They want to be around their brothers. So he said, I also know, this is a very simple villager speaking from simple sincerity, that when Shabbat ends, our extra soul, our neshama yaseir, which we spoke about, departs from us. So just like when my soul departs from my body at the time of death, I want to be surrounded by Jews. Similarly, when my extra soul departs from my body at the end of Shabbat, I also want to be surrounded by Jews. So this kind of gives a perspective in how the end of Shabbat is looked upon by Jews who really have an understanding, Jews from days gone by. So Havdalah very much has this theme. So Havdalah is geared to sort of introduce a note of optimism and hope, and most powerfully to show how Shabbat can be brought to our daily lives, to the week, not just the actual day of Shabbat. So, for the Havdalah ceremony, let's talk about the practicalities. You're going to need the actual text of the Havdalah, which I've included in a link in the chat section, and we'll post on Facebook. Also, you need a cup, which hold at least 3 fluid ounces, and wine or grape juice, aromatic spices. Cloves are a popular choice. It's what a lot of people use. But you could use cinnamon or different spices that smell good, and a candle with more than 1 wick. And all of these have very, very deep significance we're going to touch upon. We begin the Havdalah by reciting a collection of verses. We say, Hine Keli Shuasi, behold, God is my deliverance, I'm confident and I shall not fear. And this is the opening verse of Havdalah, and it shows us, again, this note, this theme of how Shabbat is going, but we are not going to be afraid of whatever the week may bring because God is with us. And then we continue a very interesting pasuk, which is known by many people as a song that we always sing at Chabad on Simchas Torah. Ush'afta mayim b'sasa mani Yeshua. You shall draw water of joy from the well springs of salvation. It's interesting that the verse chooses to use the metaphor of well springs because, at variance with the rain, when you're talking about somebody who depends on rain to water his field, let's say, that person has to rely on trusting God, because sometimes it rains and sometimes it don't, and you never really know exactly which one it's going to be. So in the olden days, when you had people who didn't have stores and didn't have markets, they literally depended on the rain coming down. So they had to have a very powerful degree of belief in God. When somebody had a spring in his property, even though of course all luck and all success is brought by God, but he was able to see on a more physical sense how he had a certain assurance, he had a certain confidence in his livelihood. So what we're saying here is, you shall draw from the well springs, not just from the rain. Even somebody who has a hard time having trust in God, which is something we all have to work towards, because we're surrounded by a very mundane world, which doesn't really facilitate kind of seeing God's providence everywhere, even if you look for it. We're saying even somebody like that, you should have joy and a comfort and a peace of mind that comes from the well springs. You should feel truly safe and secure in God's hands. And again, the other verses, Hashem Tzva'is Imanu, God is with us in the week. And we finish off by raising a cup, which is generally something associated with celebration, preemptively thanking God for giving us a successful week. And after these blessings, we take our spices, we take our candle, and we have a bit of a multi-sensory experience. So first we recite a blessing over the wine. We don't drink it yet though. We drink it when we're finished. And wine, of course, is something related to the sense of taste, which is something that brings joy. Next, we say a bracha over the fragrance. A lot of people we spoke about a few classes ago. We spoke about the bracha over food, the blessings you make before you eat food. But before you derive benefit from a pleasant smell, there are actually also blessings. Borei mine besamim, thanking God for making various kinds of herbs that have pleasant scents. So it's explained that smell is a sense which is very much connected to the soul, more than speech and more than sight. It's a bit of a Kabbalistic digression over there, but the point is, as the Rambam says, the soul is forlorn with the departure of Shabbos, so we have a scent, we have a pleasant smell to kind of give the soul comfort and relieve it. Then we say a blessing over the flame. Now we thank God, we say, Borei Meorei Ha'esh, who created the luminary of the fire. Now there are a few reasons for this. One of the interesting reasons is that God first gave the secret of making fire to Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden on Matzah Shabbos, on Saturday night. It's explained in the Talmud and the Medrash that the sin of the tree of knowledge occurred on a Friday, and God did not want to show his immediate anger right then. So there was a certain spiritual luminance. Back then there was no night and no day. It was all one extended day, as it will be when Mashiach comes. May it be speedily in our days. And when the sin of the tree of knowledge occurred, humankind was no longer worthy of having this constant light. But God did not want to take it away right as Shabbat was coming in, because it would lessen the joy of Shabbat. So he only took it away on Motzei Shabbat, on Saturday night. So Adam and Eve, I believe the Talmud says, to quote, they were freaked out of their wits, as you would be, or I would be, if the sun suddenly went down in the middle of the day. And that's us, who are used to having night. They had never seen a night before. They thought the world was ending. God comforted them, and God gave them fire. And fire really represents, in a way, the whole scope of the human struggle and what we were put on earth to do. God, interestingly enough, did not give them a fire. God gave them the tools to make a fire and the wherewithal, the knowledge, the know-how to make a fire. And God said, go make the fire yourself. In the 6 days of creation, I built everything for you. I got everything ready for you. But now you've made a choice. And this choice was actually, God set it up. But that's a discussion for a different day. You've made this choice and you've set yourself on this path, which is going to contain a lot of hardship. And I'm not always going to bail you out. But by taking what I'm giving you and using it and making the world bright, you will save yourselves. As we mentioned, you will become the creator. You will attain a triumph and a satisfaction which is much greater than anything I could ever give you. So God gave Adam and Eve this fire. It's interesting, this is very much in contrast. The Lord Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, the former chief rabbi of Britain, contrasted this with the Lahavdil, as we say, to make a separation. I talk about Abdullah, very apropos, between this story, the true story of how fire was given to humanity, and the Greek myth of Prometheus. I think it was Greek. That the gods essentially didn't want to give humanity anything. They were kind of, they didn't really care a lot. And then there was a guy named Prometheus who gave it to the people and showed them, and he was rewarded for that by being tied to a rock and having eagles eat his liver. The Greeks were great at coming up with stuff like that. Either way, God, if you contrast that with what Judaism teaches us, God wants us to make the best of our surroundings and use the tools he gave us to make the world warm and light. So that is something that we think about when we light the fire on Motzei Shabbos. which is again the anniversary of when this happened on Saturday night. So when we light the fire, we don't just light it, we hold our fingernails up and we look at our nails in the light of the candle. There are a few reasons for this. It's explained that at the same time as God gave them fire, God gave them a scaly kind of clothing, but in a more practical sense, it's explained that our fingernails are one thing that never stops growing. Eventually everyone grows up and then their body pretty much stops, but your fingernails will keep growing and growing and growing, which is sort of an illusion as we're leaving Shabbat and we're starting the week that we want to keep on growing and keep on going from strength to strength. And the Havdalah blessing itself, the blessing of Havdalah, is a very profound one. We're thanking God for making a separation between light and darkness, which seems to be kind of at variance with what we've been saying, that we're trying to introduce the light into the darkness. We're thanking God for separating the light and the darkness. And the answer to that is something very profound, that the Torah recognizes nature. Torah recognizes God made this world. He knows what it is. You cannot make something better if you deny what it is. I was reading a book written by Rabbi Shia Hecht, who was a rabbi who was famous for deprogramming people back in the 60s when there were a lot of cults and a lot of Jewish kids were getting sucked into cults. He would deprogram them and convince them that the cult is baloney, and he has many, many fascinating stories. And he says that there were many innocent Jewish souls who were brought into these cults because the cults advertised equality. All people, a black man, a white man, I don't care, you could come into my cult and we'll all be one. But afterwards, these people who were drawn to the cult and later came out realized that they weren't being one. Their individual personalities, who they were, was not being recognized. It was being trampled. The cult said, let's all be one in our devotion to this cult leader. That's not unity. Unity does not mean that we, paint over everybody's differences and we all look to something more profound or higher. What unity means is we recognize that God gave everything its own nature, its own teva, was created in a certain way, and God wants us to use those to make the world a better place. There was a very interesting story of a Jew who was a music producer for a big band in the 70s, and he grew up in a Yiddish house, and he went up to the Rebbe. He had a very fascinating exchange with the Rebbe, and he asked the Rebbe this question: does Judaism believe that everyone has to be Jewish? So the Rebbe told him the essence of a African is to be who he is as an African. The essence of a Native American is to be who he is as a Native American. That was the kind of question he asked. He was very, it was the 60s. There was a lot of doubt about that. Your essence is to be who you are. And the Rebbe concluded the essence of the Jew is bound up with God Almighty through Torah mitzvos, which is a whole other farbrengen. But the point is, when we thank God for making a separation, we thank God for the boundaries which are necessary and have to be there, which allow us to then do what we need to do and make the world a brighter place and bring Mashiach. It's also interesting that the sequence of the wine, followed by the besamim, the scent, followed by the fire, which is something which is seen, followed by the hamavda, which is an intellectual idea, parallels kind of how the senses work. The sense of taste is the most limited sense. You can only taste something which is actually in your mouth. The sense of smell is something which is a little bit more far-reaching. You can smell something which is across the room. The sense of sight is even more far-ranging than that. You can see the stars and you can see the sun. And the intellect is even more far-ranging than that, because you can understand something which you can't even see. You can understand an intellectual concept. This is actually seen on the human body. The human form was made reflecting a certain godly reality. Your mouth is the lowest, followed by your nose, followed by your eyes, followed by your brain. Interesting thought. So let's speak quickly, just to finish off, about the actual procedure of Havdalah. You fill your cup with wine until it overflows, which is similar to what we do by Kiddush. You recite the verses we spoke about, and again, there's a link to the liturgy over there in the comment section. And if others are present, they say the verse, the Jews had light and happiness and joy and honor. Kain Tielanu, so may it be for us. That's a quote from the Megillah, from the Purim story. The leader continues and says the blessing over the wine. He puts the wine down. He picks up the spices. He says the blessing on the spices. Everyone smells them. Then he says the blessing on the candles. And as we mentioned, you look at your fingernails by the light of the candles. He says the bracha of Hamavdil, the bracha of Havdalah, separating the holy from the mundane. And he drinks the wine. And traditionally, the candle is extinguished by dipping it in the wine that's overflowed from the tray. It's an old Jewish custom. Havdalah should be made on Saturday night. But if someone did not make Havdalah on Saturday night, you could make it anytime until Tuesday evening. From Wednesday, which begins Tuesday evening, you're already looking towards the next Shabbat. You do not use a candle or spices if you are reciting Havdalah after Saturday night. So that concludes our 2 parts lesson on Shabbat, which brings to a close our 5-part series on Judaism at home. Actually, let's discuss one more halacha. Hanukkah candles. The holiest rabbi in the world does not light 8 Hanukkah candles on the first night. The first night of Hanukkah, you only light 1. It's explained that the Hanukkah candles are about bringing more light and more light. The first night, the second light, and you might think, so let me light all 8. I've got 8 candles. Doesn't matter who you are, you can only light 1. Judaism is not about all or nothing. There's no such thing as hypocrisy. People shouldn't say, just because I'm not a fully observant Jew doesn't mean that means I can't take on anything because, who am I fooling? Judaism believes in taking steps. God put everybody in their upbringing, in their surroundings, in their unique set of challenges and set of growing opportunities, and everybody has a room to grow. Everybody should take it at the pace they are comfortable with. The main thing is that on every day we should seek to grow and make ourselves better than we were the day before. This is something that God teaches us, something the Rebbe always said, and through each of us doing our part where we're at to climb our own individual ladders, hopefully we'll bring to the day when, just like by the Matan Torah, which we're going to celebrate tomorrow night, when God revealed himself to the Jews and they saw the reality of what's really important and what the world really is. When Mashiach comes, it's how it's always going to be. We're going to live in a constant awareness and a constant joy in this reality, this immanence of God in this world. So again, through all of us taking our steps that we feel we're ready to take to bring godliness and to bring Shabbos into our lives, may we speedily see the day when all eyes will see God. Meher v'yameinu speedily in our days. Amen. Thank you all so much for exploring these insights with me. I really feel like I gained a lot from it. I hope you did too. And thank you for allowing me this opportunity. Thank you for coming. All right. You're muted. You're unmuted. Yeah. Everyone's unmuted. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you, Dovi. It was wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Great job.
And I hope to see you in person this Shavuos with Mashiach. That'll be nice.
All right.
Enjoy some cheesecake. All right. See you all soon. Next class, God willing. Sometime.
Guys.
Bye-bye.